Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. And welcome to Arkway Ministries Church Bible class. I'm Pastor Elder Orlando James Arcady of Arkway Ministries Church. Praise the Lord and welcome again. Sorry we're a little late. I got caught up in making some adjustments to the PowerPoint for tonight. And I see I am over 17 minutes late, so I apologize. So we are going to get started with tonight's message and lesson. We're going to continue with the Jewish Apocryphal writings and their impact on the New Testament writers and the early church and everyone within that first generation, that first century, especially in the early portions and the lead up after the Hasmonean dynasty and the development of apocalyptic prophets and what everyone was looking for and thinking about within a specific vein, or what the contentions were during that time period between the rabbinical orthodox of the Pharisees and the rabbinical orthodox of the Sadducees, which are the more Hellenistic. And we're going to be looking at the Hellenistic influences as they seem to be more intuitively, intrinsically entrenched within the Christian world at that time. This by no means is me saying that Jesus was a Sadducee. He was more likely a Pharisee, but the presentation of the message, which was much more Hillel-ish to an olive branch to the Gentiles, was more or less the viewpoint of those that existed within that time period, especially that early period when Jesus was doing his ministry between the years of 27, 28, 29, 30, or 30, 31, 32, 33. And so depending upon the 3-year ministry. And so we're going to be looking at what brought that idea to the stage and set the space for that influence to catch fire and burn as brightly as it has afterwards, from this small group of individuals to a major world religion. We're going to be talking about the sources for the most part at this point of time, and we're going to be speaking about the Jewish Apocrypha, not the Christian Apocrypha books. And then we'll talk about a little bit of a difference. The Jewish Apocrypha books are those that are written between the year 300 BCE, before Common Era, to 100 BCE, before Common Era. That's the time period before year one, not the time period after year one. Okay. We're going to be talking about that today. So let's go ahead and get started. I know we're starting a little bit late, and if we run out of time, then I'll pick it up next week, and then we'll go over a couple more things. We're going to go back over this content a little more in depth, because I don't have the time today to go over the clarifying points of some of the tables that are coming up at the end, because the information within those tables to understand what's going on and what's happening within the scriptures of the New Testament, I believe, is going to be vital and extremely important to those who are really, really trying to get information on what's going on within the scriptures. Okay? All right. So let's go ahead and get started with our presentation. Introduction to the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and their influence on the New Testament. To examine the Jewish Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, what do they mean? Apocrypha writings are those hidden writings, and the Pseudepigrapha are those writings that are written by, that are attributed to someone but not written by that person. And so these are writings that are much more, I would say, scandalous, but nevertheless were considered to be very good presentations and representations of the belief structure to which they afford themselves its source, as their source. They represented the Hellenistic Jewish world very well and very complete, in such a manner that they were considered as holy canon and as holy scriptures as their predecessors, that which comes out of the Tanakh, especially since they were around the time period of the Hasmonean dynasty when they were canonizing or defining what books would go into the Tanakh. These were the challengers and the ones that were pushed out, just like the Bible were, the Septuagint were, those writings that didn't make it in, but they were completed or they're a part of maybe one book and not the regular canon of the Bible that we have today, especially from the reformers of the King James Version versus the Catholic Bible and those other writings that are in there. They didn't make it into the King James. Each iteration kind of decides how they want their faith to be demonstrated to the world, and they customize the belief structures within the writings of the book, utilizing the Bible as the source doctrinal principles. And so this is how we get the earlier. And so what we're talking about are the predate of that activity. Yet the activity, but the source of the activities that came later, including deciding which books are in the canon and which books are not in the canon, which sources back to Jewishness and the Jewish Great Assembly, and what they decided to go in and what they didn't decide to go in. So we're going to be talking about that as well. To clarify the definitions and the reason of the Apocryphas, the reason we're going to be examining the Apocryphas, the Jewish Apocrypha, and is to clarify their definitions, survey their historical development, and analyze the theological conceptual influence on the New Testament. By tracing key texts and themes from the Hellenistic period through the post-temple period, or not post, after the temple destroyed. This study demonstrates how the Second Temple Jewish literature serves as a crucial bridge between the Hebrew Bible and the early Christian thought. And so what we are talking about is the space between the development of the Tanakh and the belief structure in the early Christian church. Where did the belief structure come from? Why did they think that there was going to be a certain person that's going to be from the divine and perform? Why did that make sense to them? If it had never existed somewhere, where did they come from? Did they develop it out of the sky? They didn't develop it out of the sky. No one develops anything out of the sky, especially the church, especially early Christians. Everything comes from a source. What sources did they use? And we're going to be talking about one of those sources, or the primary source that propelled the development of the early Christian church to its prominence, and that would be the Jewish Apocrypha writings, the Jewish hidden books, the ones that didn't make it into the Tanakh for reasons that were ascribed to by the Jews of that early Hasmonean dynasty, the Great Assembly period. Okay, so those are the individuals that those are the things that we're going to be talking about. An introduction. We're going to be dealing with this in a couple of different parts. We're going to cover an introduction, clarification of terms, historical overview, a theological and conceptual framework depicting the apocalyptic worldview of the Son of Man, the personified wisdom of the Logos theology, afterlife and resurrection, the intermediate state, and the nature of sin, Satan, and demons. Then we're going to talk about some of the specific themes and imagery that we find common between the Jewish Apocrypha writings and the New Testament writings, how they progressed over into the New Testament, where did they pop up at, where did they come from, a visual timeline of writings between the general Hellenistic period and the post-temple period. And then we're going to have a discussion, conclusion, and then we'll be done with everything. And I'll probably go over some bibliography, where do things come from, who else had these views, and where those sources come from. So everyone knows that we're on the up and up, or at least that I'm trying to be as forthwith with the information as we possibly can, that it didn't just come out of my head. All right, I'm going to streamline this one really quickly because we don't have a lot of time. But I'm going to also go back over it next Wednesday, and we'll cover a little bit more of it there. And this will also be online for you to be able to go back and take a look at. So let's get started, shall we? Introduction. The transition from the Hebrew Bible to the New Testament is marked by a rich corpus of Jewish literature, known as the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. The texts composed between the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century BCE. This is between 300 to 200 BCE, before year 1, and 200 to 100 BCE, before year 1. Okay, so they were written between that 200-year period, including the Septuagint, which was lost, not the Septuagint of Origen. Please don't get confused when they tell you Septuagint. Many writings that existed during the time period of the 100 BCE to 100 CE were portions of scriptures that reflected and increased information of the Tanakh, which also included the Septuagint that had been written, that had been developed in the 3rd century BCE as a Septuagint, but they weren't. They weren't the Septuagint. They were adaptations of that Septuagint. This leads to a lot of confusion in many churches' teachings regarding the authority of the source of, say, the apostles, of the Apostle Paul, of Apollos, of many early devout believers and developers of doctrinal principles and churches within the early church, that it stated that they had the Septuagint as their source of information. They had a Septuagint, a rendering, not the Septuagint, not a copy of the Septuagint. There's only like one or two copies, one copy actually. I think it's maybe one or two copies, and they both burned in the Library of Alexandria. The point was to only have one Septuagint, and that one unique book existed within the greatest location of information and scholarly information within Alexandria. And if you needed to go for intellectual stimulation and understanding and knowledge, you went to Alexandria and you read those one books of the world, which means that you had to pay to get to them. And you had to be somebody very important to be able to read them and gain access to them. And it was literally, you get me. So they only had one book of the Septuagint for a very, very, very long time. And then after it was burned, then maybe people decided to just take the Tanakh and expand upon it, adding in their Apocrypha writings and calling that a Septuagint. Does that make sense? That's how the development of the concept and ideas of the 1st century churches and the 1st century users, being that they had a Septuagint to write and to use. They did not. They used an adaptation of the Tanakh and writings that were popular to their particular points of views. Okay, and they called that a Septuagint. All right. Now, clarification of terms. Apocrypha. What does Apocrypha mean? Apocrypha means books that are included in the Old Testament canons of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, but excluded from the Jewish Tanakh and most Protestant Bibles. These works were primarily composed between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. Those were the Apocrypha writings. Those writings that were a part of that were added to certain things in the New Testament, but not a part of the Jewish Tanakh. Pseudepigrapha, a broader category of Jewish writings between the 3rd BCE, 300 to 200, and the 2nd, 200 to 100, attributed to ancient figures such as Enoch, Abraham, Moses, but not authorized, authenticated. They're unauthenticated writings. It's pseudepigrapha. They're attributed to this person, but not written by that person. Okay. And so they carried weight because of who they were. They were named of being written by the person who wrote it. And that was a very big practice within the early period Anyone could write a book, and writing a book was very tedious and cost worthy. And if you were going to do so, you wanted money off of it. So you wrote maybe 1-2 books of the same types, and you sold it as a unique entity to a specific collector, or developer or organization that would take your book, read your book, see if it was worthy of being added, pay you for your book, and then you would be famous for writing books, and you'd be able to write another book, and you'd be able to get money, and you get me. And so that's a very lucrative environment. So many people wrote books. Didn't have to be perfect, but it had to have a certain course of ideas that were common within that time frame, so that it wouldn't be considered as outright, not heresy or anything like that, but just nonsense. It would have to follow and flow with the Platonistic views of the day. It would have to make more sense in order for it to be purchased by the wider world outside of the Jewish world, because the Jewish world only accepted what came through the Great Assembly, through the temple, through that system. Anything else was denied and rejected. So if you were going to write something, it had to be to the wider world, and it had to be to the Greek world, and it had to include those aspects, that framework that was necessary in order for it to be viable within that realm. And so in order for somebody else to be able to get it and someone else to be able to have it, it would have to be produced in a cottage industry. It would have to be, it would then be altered by a scribe who, depending upon what he went through whatever it is that he went through to create it, mess-ups, mistakes, issues, problems, whatever. Didn't really matter, because the writer or the reader would just fill it in with whatever they needed to, if they needed to. Not only that, the reader would just need the book for the uniqueness of it, and that kind of thing. And so that would be one area, that writing and stuff. And so if they had these books, they would have to be able to get them and use them and understand them. And most of these books that we're talking about within this period are all written in Greek and not Hebrew, okay? And that's what set them apart from the Jewish Tanakh. These are written in Greek. Nothing written in Greek were ever added to the Jewish Tanakh, only Hebrew and Daniel, which contains a little bit of Aramaic. And that's about it. All right. So let's continue forth. Then we have the impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls, being a collection of texts from the Jewish sect of the Essenes, one of the 4 groups within the early Jewish period. The 4 groups are the Essenes, Zealots, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Those are the 4 groups. Those 4 groups made up the majority of the political identification of the early Judean period for the Jewish people at that time period, after the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. This group, the scrolls included biblical manuscripts, sectarian rules, and previously unknown writings that were written ascribing themselves to people, but written by somebody else, or pseudepigrapha. Okay. The historical overview. All of the writings before the 3rd century BCE, or within the 3rd century BCE, this is the height of the Hellenistic period. The Jews lived under Greek authority, and this fostered theological innovation and blending of Jewish and Hellenistic ideas. And this is the greatest period of the earliest portion of Jewish syncretism. There really wasn't that much syncretism, even though it was in Jewish sciences, regarding the Zoroastrian period of Persia. But when the Greeks came in and liberated the Jews, then the Jews thanked them. And one of the aspects of Alexander the Great being so good was that he said that they could still practice Hellenism, but then they were still under the authority of the Greeks. And then as Ptolemy kicked in and other pro-Greek rulers over the Judea provinces pushed a primary Greek modem onto the Jews, then you began to see the acceptance of the Greek systems and Greek innovations countering the staunchness of the traditionalists and the old world guard of the Jewish Pharisees. And so that's where that development develops, that grow and grows. So within that period of that 3 BC, 300 to 200, during this period, the Septuagint is written, the original Septuagint, which only contains the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah portion of the Old Testament. It did not include the prophets, nor the scriptures. One key observation that we should note about the Bible, keep this in the back of your head, the Tanakh is written in a language, in a way where it ascribes the belief structure of the Jewish people in such way. The law introduces you to God. The prophets tell you that you're going to make a mistake and show you how that when you do make a mistake, these are certain things that you can do it. And the scriptures expressly tell you how to get out of the mistakes that you have made, and that there is a promise that you will not have to die in the mistakes that you made. In the King James Bible and in the Septuagint and the writings of the Christian church, was developed after the Catholic Church, and that's so, and was ratified during the first period, during the 3rd or 4th period, the 5th periods of the Bible, of the development, and the Bible of origin, how they changed it and they made the order different. They included the New Testament writings within it and they changed the order of the highly touted Jewish methodology within the Tanakh. They changed it to make a different message, in such that the Torah, which is still the primary portion, you can't change that. There was authority, there was precedence, there was respect to God in that way. But then the prophets and the scriptures are flipped. And so the next thing after the Torah come the scriptures, and then come the prophets, which leads you to the understanding or the teaching that in the Christian world, that you are introduced to God, you are shown how good God is and what his mercy is, and then you're shown how people messed up. And this tells you that you need Jesus by introduction into the New Testament. So that's the way the books roll within the King James Bible, within the Catholic Bibles, within all the earlier Septuagints. That's the way it rolls. So if you're looking for a book and you're talking about trying to figure out where it is, just remember, are you talking about trying to show people how good God is and how kind he is? Then you're going into the scriptures, which is right after the Torah and comes up right after Joshua. Then you start into the scriptures, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and all that good stuff. And then if you're looking for how people mess up and how to get people back on order, and you want obedience, you want that structure, then you go into the prophets, which is right before the development of the New Testament. And if you want to show the relief and the structure and the fulfillment of the promises, then you go into the New Testament. And so that's how that flows in the Bible. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about the development of the Bible. But right now, it's just a very interesting note to discover. Okay, all right, we're done with that one. We're into the clarification of terms, and we just finished the clarification of terms. Sorry, I should have gone on to the next slide. I got a little excited. I'm trying to rush, okay? Now we're into the historical overviews of this portion, the core apocryphal books. The core apocryphal books are Tobit. It was written between 225 and 175 BCE. It is a writing about the diaspora, or the expulsion into Babylon, into Persia, and into Greek development before they developed and created their own Hasmonean dynasty. So it's a writing about the limitation of that period of time period. That is Tobit. It talks about piety, angelology, marriage, burial of the dead, how to bury the dead. So this is where we get into that concept of idea of baptism, how the dead are prepared, what you do before the burial or during the burial of dead, why the burial is important. So the baptism concept and ideas comes from Tobit's view of the early portion of series, Wisdom of Ben Sira, or Sirach, which is also called Sirach, a collection of ethical wisdoms with a focus on the temple period, the priesthood, and the fear of the Lord, all respect and understanding who God is, and that concept. That's what it's talking about. And then you have the book of First Enoch, which is one of the most influential books, I would say, of the period between, say, 200 BCE and 200 CE. I would say it would be the most influential writing in terms of progenitational influence. It starts here and then it radiates out into the times. We still hold major developments written within the book of Enoch as the way the world works, even though this was all created by somebody within that 3rd century. Excuse me. It was out of his mind. He came up with it. He used the Jewish scriptures to develop something that was much more Hellenistic. And that's what they all did. And he never intended it to get that big, but it did. It was a primary source of revelations, of salvation, demons and idols, the idea that supported the Gnostic principles. Much are found within the book of Enoch. Okay, other noted pseudepigraphas that are written, Aramaic Levi document the book of priests, and the book of Jubilees is another book that if you get a chance to read it online, go ahead and read it. It's fascinating writing. It talks about the retelling of Genesis, Exodus. This is where you get the concept, earlier concept and an idea of the word as a logos concept and an idea. Exodus emphasizing a solar calendar and a strict food requirements, what you can eat, what you can't eat. Many of these things are all talked about within the New Testament writings because they were within these books, and the individuals that were a part of the early church utilized the teachings within these books to develop the early Christian model, okay, the framework. So we're talking about the basic framework of Christianity right now. All right. The next overview, the post-temple, after the temple were destroyed. These are those writings that were Jewish, but written after the temple were destroyed, and the hidden writings, and they still have some sort of Pseudepigrapha. But most of these writings are written as a response to the destruction of the temple. And so they're much more lamentational in their development and their presentation. Fourth Ezra or Second Esdras explores the theodicy and the apocalyptic visions in response to Jerusalem's destruction. So it looks at the destruction, and then what it does is what many Gnostics, let me explain something to you when I say this. What many Gnostic influenced writers do. They look at a condition or writing or situation, and they find the Platonic links and magnify them to sell the writing. This is just a cottage industry construct, right? And so this is what someone does. It's not unnormal. It's absolutely normal. It's the way you do it. Otherwise, your book never gets sold because it never gets picked up because there's no points of references to anything that's real within that time period. So you have to utilize the Neoplatonic method of transmission and development of writings in order to be relevant and just literally make sense. Okay. And so that's just the way it works. It's not done out of trying to mislead, but that's the way the world worked at that time period. No one's trying to say, oh, we have more information, but they had that information. I hope everyone understands what I'm trying to say. So the writings are basically presented as a response to either the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty and the impact of Greco-Roman influence and syncretism on a staunchly preservist, conservative group of Jewish peoples, communities, and races within that early 300 to 200 period, third century and second century BCE, and the destruction of that people after the year 70 within the first century. Second Baruch, consolation and revelation about the end times and resurrection. In other words, he's looking at what's happening and then he starts to create it. So much of Revelations comes out of Second Baruch. Okay, much of Revelation comes out of Second Baruch. And Third Baruch talks about the mystical journeys through the heavens. We talk about the Paradiso. Those aspects, that area of the third Baruch is much more something that the Catholic Church would have held very close to them as primary, because they use that imagery and that picture of the beauty of heaven and what it's going to look like when they resurrect from the dead. Okay, and that comes from the earlier portions. And so another thing to note is that if you are writing or reading or applying the principles of these writing constructs that existed in 100, 120, 130, 90, 80, 60, 70, whatever, during that time period, you would have support and in the truth of those concepts from the apocryphal writings that were Hellenistic and Greek, because they match what you were writing in the latter age. So they hold more weight than the Jewish Hebraic Tanakh, which doesn't translate into that time period very well. Okay, so you need specific individuals that could try to make it match. That's where you get Origen, you get Tertullian, you get other Justin Martyr, those individuals that learn Hebrew to try and make the connection. Plutonus, those guys. All right, testaments and legends. Testament of Abraham, the life of Adam and Eve, which I believe is also a very interesting reading for understanding Logos theology. It's the expansion of Genesis, focusing on repentance and resurrection, and the presence and the recognition of understanding of idea that the entity of the word is a separate entity, or consider the Logos. The idea of the term Logos, which is speaking or word, and the word was, all of that stuff comes from that Logos theology principle. So the life of Adam and Eve, the writing of Adam and Eve, first Adam and Eve, is very influential, especially the third chapter of Adam and Eve, when they faint and they're forced to deal with that they're getting kicked out, and they feel like they're about to die, and the word comes and it consoles them and gives them energy and revitalizes them and speaks to them as they're speaking to another entity, which isn't God. And so that concept is the earlier portion of how the early church viewed the relationship between Jesus and God, as Jesus is the personified Logos. It's just amazing to understand that, to see that, and then to hear all of the competing views of Trinity versus non-Trinity, what it is, and all of the definitions that they develop of it, the egg, and you're going, you don't even know what you're talking about. But that's just the way, because they don't go and look and read and see what it is in these apocrypha books. So that's why I'm telling you, if you want to not be confused, if you want to understand this stuff, you're going to have to go back to these old books and see where everything came from. All right. Okay. The theological frameworks, the apocalyptic worldview of the Son of Man, sourcing from First Enoch, the parables of First Enoch between chapters 37 and 71. Yes, and Enoch was expanded after 37. So everything from 1 to 37 is an early rendering. Everything from 38 on to 78 or something like that to the end of it are all later renderings. They're later add-ons. Excuse me. So when we talk about the early church and their influence, where they were influenced as far as Enoch, and I told you Enoch was one of the most biggest influentials. Most of the things that influenced the early church are going to be between 1 and 37. Everything after 37 is going to be a much more later influence regarding the beautification of Jesus, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. And those beautifications are going to be found within those areas, or the demonologies and the way the impact worlds, the apocalyptic writings are going to be more the later ones. All right. The Son of Man in the Gospels, the personified logos theology. We talked about the personified logos theology, or the concept of wisdom as an emanation of God informs the logos theology in John 1 through 14. It is the source of Philo. It comes from the writings of the book of Enoch. It's sourced from there. Its impact is felt within John 1 through 14, Colossians 1, 15 through 20, and Hebrews 1, 2, and 3. All of those, praise the Lord, all of those writings, all of those ideas in Hebrews, Colossians, John, and the Johannine writings, all of those logos theology principles, all sourced from the book of Enoch, 1 through 30, scriptures 37 through source between most of it is the Adam and Eve 1 through I see it in 3, but I also have other information that leads me up to that point. But most of it is going to be between 37, 38, 37, 71 of the book of Enoch. So afterlife and the resurrection and the intermediate state, as we go on with that Paul presented in Thessalonians chapter 5, 4 and 5, that idea of resurrection and rapture, that sources from Second Maccabees and the wisdom of Solomon, more so the wisdom of Solomon than the Second Maccabees. I think there's maybe like a little bit of something like that in Maccabees, not much enough to, but the wisdom of Solomon, the apocryphal writing called the Wisdom of Solomon, has that down pat, which means Paul had access to the wisdom of Solomon. That also means that many communities within Asia Minor did not have access to the wisdom of Solomon, which means the writing had to have existed in the desert with the Essenes, and that's where you'd go to get it. Okay? And many of these writings were with the Essenes, and that's when they went in the desert, that's where they would go, and that's where they would learn. Both the Gospels, many of the Gospels and Acts tells you that Jesus, Paul, those primary two images within the New Testament, both went into the desert and came out of the desert with knowledge after they went into the desert. Tempted or expressively taught, learned, and went there for work. That's where you would go to get those understanding and ideas, and they would exist within the writings within the Essenes because they would have those books. And so the idea of the nature of Satan and the demons comes out of the first book of Enoch and the writings of the Watchers, which is spoken of in both the first portion, 1 through 37, and the latter portions between 37 through 71. This is regarding the fallen angels. It provides the background for the New Testament's developed demonology and the figure of Satan. It comes from First Enoch, the Book of Watchers. Before that, in the Gnostic principles, is Iliabog, but the idea of blending the two comes out of the Catholic Church, which is sourced out of the reference to the Book of Enoch, and that Book of Enoch is a part of the Catholic canon books that they hold. Not necessarily that which is edited by the reformists of Luther and that came later, but you get my understanding. Okay, and then we talk about the next portion we're going to talk about, the next slide, specific themes and imagery. In this portion of script, in this writing, number 5, I think we got about 3 minutes. I don't know how we're going to go. Maybe I'll do it till like maybe 8:01, 8:10, 8:03. We'll see how far we go. I won't do the visual timeline in the summary tables. I'll do that next Wednesday, because for the tables, well, let's just get through this, and then when I show you about the tables, I have extra information that I'm going to have to just like repackage and present to you in a much clearer manner than I originally wanted to, and I ran out of time. I got everything done, but that's what was keeping me over, building that up, and I don't have the time to go over it now. I don't want to keep you here all night. It's New Year's. All right. So the specific themes and imagery. In this portion, we talk about the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 13 through 15, serves as a template for Paul's argument in Romans 1 through 18, justification, judgment. In this area, we're talking about justification, the idea of justification, that you don't need the works, that you don't need to perform, you don't need to do something first, that salvation is afforded to you by virtue of simply accepting the authority of the righteous one. And that concept of the righteous one comes out of the Book of Enoch and is reinforced through the books of Adam and Eve, and through Baruch, and through some of the the power. This is a PowerPoint. I do have it in a Word document as well. So yeah, I can give it to you Sunday. I can provide that to anyone that wants it on Sunday. And you can have a copy of the writing that I'm going through, that all of this is sourced off of. All right, I get it for you. And then you have the practical wisdom and the ethics of Sirach's influence is evident in the Epistle of James, which mirrors the style and themes of the other Paul's writings, and the apocalyptic imagery that we find within Revelation, within hints of the Gospels, that sources out of 2nd Baruch and 4 Ezra, the vocabulary, the imagery with Revelation and the synoptic apocalypses of Matthew, Mark. Those sources, they don't have them in Luke and in John. John doesn't have that at all. But in Matthew and Luke, or Mark and Matthew, which were the earlier 2 Gospels, it's very prominent, and it's very telling that they did use the writings of Baruch, 2nd Baruch, and 4 Esdras, especially the expanded versions of Esdras, which are after or the post temple destruction of the year 70. Okay. So that's all we'll do tonight. I'll do the visual timeline. I'll go back over some of the earlier stuff. I have about, just 2 more slides. You know what? I'm going to give you a quick presentation, and then we'll go back over it again. And then we'll be done. How about that? It's 8:01. I can give me about maybe 2 more minutes, if that's okay. All right. The first portion of the table that we'll be talking about next week will cover the reinforcement of understanding what we're working with and what was written when. We talk about the Hellenistic period, and the transition period, and then the post-temple period. So that means the Hellenistic period would stretch between 300 to 100 BCE. That's 200 years of the Hellenistic, syncretistic, Greco-Roman, Gnostic, Zoroastrian, God-fearer influential impact on the developing Gnostic, Hellenistic, Jewish mindset, and the development of the cottage industry to write books that blended the two or the three different belief structures within that time period of Damascus, within the area of Damascus, Judea, Asia Minor, where the Jews were, and mix them together. And the writings that did that, all considered as Septuagints. And how that time period was very, very influential to the the ground that the early church would come up out of, would develop out of. That would be the Hellenistic portioned period. The transition period is where I'm talking about the most. That period that's afterwards. That's after the Maccabee Revolt, the Hasmonean and Roman Wars, and the development of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Psalms of Solomon, and the Messianic hope, which would come after the destruction of the Second Temple. And then, not the destruction of the Second Temple, the creation of the Second Temple. Because it was during the Second Temple, during the development or the existence of the temple, which was built within the Hasmonean period, that the idea that the Messiah was ready to come was fomented within the Jewish people. That's just the way that it worked. They didn't think about there needing to be another third temple. They just saw it as a second temple because they just developed it. They just got it back. All right. And so then you had the post-temple destruction after 70, in which we have 4 Ezra, 2nd Baruch, the life of Adam and Eve, with the development, with the impact of trauma upon the Jewish people and the loss of the temple, the mysticism that developed, which was the mysticism that we find in the development of, it's just a small portion of the mysticism that we find in the development of the book of Revelation. Revelation is a historical book that's written in a mystical manner. It's how you sold. I don't want to cheapen it to that point, because a lot of people hold it as theologically holy, right? They shouldn't do that with Revelation. Not even the church fathers that even said that it should be there wanted you to even think of it that way. But we do, because we have the influences of Enoch, which provide us the groundwork for looking at Revelations through the lens of Enoch. And I hope that makes sense. And since we do that, we have this overarching desire for Revelations to be just as holy as Isaiah, and it should not be. It should not be, but it is to many Christian denominations, Christian churches, which means in the Catholic Church, I guess they would say they teach it right, versus in the Reformation churches who use it. Now, Martin Luther didn't want it in there, but other people said it should be there because it's a part of showing the hope that to come. And so the mysticism, the afterlife, And that's where the hope comes in. It shows you this is what's going to happen in the afterlife, and this is where your hope is. And then we talk about the second table, which is the New Testament concepts. And so we begin to see what developed in the New Testament concepts and where they came from and where the Jewish sources are. We'll talk about what those Jewish sources look like next week. I'm gonna start off with around the middle portion of this rendering of the earlier video of the earlier chat to get everybody back in focus. And then we're going to go into this table very in-depthly. So I don't have time to do it today. But to give you a hint, to get you prepared, there are some books that you can try to read between now and next Wednesday online. And that is the Book of Enoch. You can even listen to that as an audio book. I would suggest you listen to it as an audio book, at least to have heard some of the terminology and the ideas and the flow, and then get some questions about, so when are they talking about the watchers? When are the watchers influencing the world? Is it before the flood or is it after the flood? So what are the spirits of the giants? Are the spirits of the giants the evil forces that we deal with on a daily basis? Or is it some other evil entity that's coming from heaven? Which one is that kind of stuff? Those questions are all presented or sourced from the first book of Enoch, 1 through 37. Okay, or at least it introduced you there, and then they kind of expand into the world that it functions, and then you get an understanding of where the imagery comes from in Revelations, so that literally the only chapter within Revelations that points to the book of Enoch becomes chapter 22. Okay. All right. Then the pre-existent word logos and the wisdom of Solomon, which held a lot of weight with early Hellenistic Jews because it demonstrated the Gnostic equitable influence in Judaism existed in companionship with the Greco-Roman world Platonic view of how the cosmogony worked in the world. So you get this idea that the Logos theological principles, and the idea that Paul talked about in Acts, I think it's 17, where he walked in the garden, he saw all the statues and one in the middle that was to the unknown. And what that was is Logos theology. And he begins to say that this Logos theology is Jesus and God, the one God. And so the Neoplatonists take that and say, okay, let's do this. Let's take that and we bring this into it, and then we'll make it, we'll use the Jewish terminology for these entities and for this entity and at least that entity in your development of modelism. Then it develops and grows into the ideas of Trinity. So that aspect, first, the wisdom of Solomon is great. It impacts John 1 through 14, Colossians 1, 15 through 17. And then we talk about the bodily resurrection, which is the influence of Thessalonians and Corinthians, which comes out of 2nd Maccabees. You have the origin of demons and Satans, which comes out of book 1, out of first Enoch, book 1 of Enoch. When it begins to talk about that, that's the early portions of the book of Enoch. The critique of idolatry, which also is the reference in the wisdom of Solomon, chapters 13 through 15. The book of Sirach, which gives us the ethics, how we should operate, what we should touch and what we can't touch, what we should do. And this is for the Hellenistic church, the Hellenistic Jews, and what makes them holy, or what they present themselves as, or what fruits look like. Fruits, the idea and the concept and the teachings of fruit comes out of Sirach. The apocalyptic imagery of Revelations and Matthew, I talked about that, 2nd Baruch and Esdras. Much of it has to do with the destruction of the Second Temple and the reaction, the reflective reaction on that event. So with that being said, we're done for the night. Thank you for staying with me a little bit longer. I appreciate your time. I do not count it lightly. So we're going to be done. There's a discussion later that would go over, but we'll do that next Wednesday. All right. God bless you all. Have a happy new year. I'll be praying for each and every last one of you. I hope everyone has a good new year, a safe new year. And I'll be praying for each and every one of you in Jesus' name. Bye-bye.